let's kick things off, Ryan, by talking about Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah. And we're going to dive into his game, and we're going to talk about where you see him in the draft. But I thought it was interesting to point out that the last time you're 29 years old, right? You're cool with me telling everybody that, right?
Yep.
That means the last time that Notre Dame had an off-ball linebacker get drafted in the first round of the NFL draft, you were not even born. I'm in my 40s. I was 4 years old. That was 1982 when Bob Crable, an off-ball linebacker, was drafted in the first round. Now, you and I talked about this off the air. If Jalen Smith doesn't get hurt against Ohio State, he's not only in the first round, he's a top 5 to 10 pick, right?
Absolutely.
But it's still, even if you include him, that's not a lot of linebackers going in round one. So Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah is getting a lot of round one love. When you have broken him down over the last couple of years, obviously strength number one is he's from Virginia. As I've established on this podcast for a long time, that's where the real ballers are from. No offense. But when you dive into the tape, what do you see from him, and what are the strengths he has as a player, but also more so, how does his game translate to the National Football League?
Yeah, I think it's a great conversation, especially with the long sequence of linebackers for Notre Dame not being selected in the first round. I think partly that's due to the fact of like, hey, this the position. I think it's unfair to a degree because I still value a dominant second level defender, but to a degree, linebackers are becoming devalued in how the game is played today in the NFL. You really need a special player that can impact the pass game and the run game equally. There's not those two down thumpers as much as they once were. But when you look at a guy like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, obviously former safety, moving into that rover position. And is it fair to call him actually a linebacker? That's, I think, the starting point, because he is playing an overhang position, which in the NFL doesn't really exist anymore. Because usually you're taking that Sam linebacker, you're gonna flex him in between the tackle and the number 2 receiver in the apex. Like that's kind of like the spot that he's playing. In the NFL now, you're taking that player out of the game in most instances, and you're bringing in a nickel, right? So like that position is not very translatable. But what makes you so excited about a guy like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah is, I think it goes into the positionless football moniker that Matt Rule is trying to really establish in the Carolina Panthers. Is he a perfect fit as a will linebacker? Maybe not. Is he a perfect fit as a strong safety? Maybe not. But what Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah is athletically is a outstanding athlete in short spaces. He's shown the ability to play some man-to-man coverage. He has shown the closing speed to blitz from various spots. He's shown just that closing speed in general to really come up in short zones. Like there is so much to like, and there's such a dynamic element to him. I think that he is going to be heavily valued in the first round, just because whether you want to try to label him again as a safety, as a linebacker, wherever you want, I'm going to call him a dynamic second level defender, and I'm going to figure out where he fits best. And I know a lot of NFL teams are going to be scared a little bit just because is he a perfect fit in a spot? But I think for a creative defensive coordinator, they are going to just be enthralled with the positionless type of aspect that Jeremiah brings to the game. It's similar to Isaiah Simmons last year out of Clemson. Now, obviously, different body types. Isaiah's a much longer guy, but it's the same kind of profile. It's the same prototype. Those guys aren't going to fit perfectly into any spot, but you're going to put them on the second level of defense, and you're going to take advantage of their athletic skill set and in different mismatch situations. Because in such a mismatched league that it has become now, guys that are able to play man-to-man against safeties, play man-to-man against slot receivers, like those players that can eliminate those perceived matchup advantages, I think is so invaluable in this ever-evolving passing league.
So when you look at a guy like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, could there be a chance where maybe his talent grade and where he gets drafted are different? Because what I'm hearing from you is, and we've seen this in the NFL, I think we saw this with Isaiah Simmons a little bit last year. Now, he still went in the top 10, but went a little lower than a lot of people were projecting, and that was sort of that knock on him. Do you see a scenario where, like, you could say, for example, where do you have him kind of just from a pure talent standpoint? Is he top 10, top 15, top 20, top 25? Where do you kind of see him slotting in this draft, just from a pure talent player type of situation?
We have him as a top 20 player, and I'm very
Okay.
on board with the conversation. The spot that just keeps flashing to me, I know they moved back a couple spots with the playoffs, but if he somehow gets to the Cleveland Browns, I feel like
Hmm.
that's the floor to where he goes because they have a bunch of guys like the Jacob Phillips from LSU last year and Mac Wilson who are a little bigger body guys. To have a guy like him that kind of couples with that size, for me, the Cleveland Browns are the floor, but I think he's a top 20 player. Maybe the I keep saying Oakland, Las Vegas Raiders would be an absolute dynamite fit, I think, too. So I think top 20 player, probably the floor is the Cleveland Browns in worst case scenario.
Do you think there's a scenario in which he could slide more because of what you talked about? There's going to be some, because let's be honest, right? What we're seeing in the NFL and in college to a degree is offensively, there's a lot of these really young minds and
Mm-hmm.
they're innovative and they're not stuck in the traditional, you have to play the game this way, this way, this way. We're not seeing that trend as much on defense. We're still seeing that, to me, there's still a lot of older, been in the league a while type of defensive coordinators. We're starting to see a little bit of an influx of some new blood. And I think a guy like Todd Bowles, kind of being that middle ground between those two, having success this year with Tampa Bay could help that. But do you think that there is still some of that in the NFL? Could that cause him to maybe fall? Are you concerned that maybe he might fall a little bit? Because let's just say the Browns are sitting there and you say that's the floor, but you and I
Mm-hmm.
both know if somebody else falls that the Browns valued higher at a position, then they're going to take that guy. That's usually how the draft board works. And so is because of that not every team is willing to take a positionless football player. Is there a chance for a guy like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, more a defensive end, a defensive tackle, a corner, to fall because of that? He doesn't necessarily have here's the position you can plug him in and play.
I think it's always possible. I think that there's, I mean, it's a great point that you haven't seen that trend of young defensive minds as much as you've seen offensively. But I feel like in this stage, trying to keep up with those offensive minds, like you need to change with the times, or else you're going to get cast to the wayside. Like that's not like how you play. You can't get stuck in the mindset where this is what I've been doing for the longest time, and I don't care what offense is
Mm-hmm.
doing because that's how you're going to get beat, every time.
Mm-hmm.
You need to really prey on matchups and be able to change with how the times are changing. This isn't where we're going to draft a big bodied linebacker that can't move in space. Like that guy just isn't as valuable anymore. So I think, and especially in this draft where we have Micah Parsons, who's an assumed top 10 pick out of Penn State, and there's a lot of good linebackers. I really think it's one of the more underrated classes. I think the linebacker have a lot of guys like Nick Bolton from Missouri and Baron Browning from Ohio State. And there's a lot of dudes that you get really excited about. Zaven Collins from Tulsa. But for me, there's a significant drop off from number one, Micah Parsons, to the next guy. And I truly do believe that the NFL is going to value Jeremiah maybe as that second linebacker just because of what the upside is athletically. Because for like a Zaven Collins, who's like that true 4-3 Sam backer that can come up and play some on ball. And even a Nick Bolton, who's a little undersized and maybe not the most rangy player of all time. Like those guys are a little more limited than a guy like Jeremiah. I think a guy like Owusu-Koramoah, the NFL really is going to value because although every defensive coordinator is not completely, enthralled in the positionless football moniker, I do think that seeing a guy like him on the second level and ability to create matchups that are advantageous for your best football, I think it's going to be I think it's going to be very valuable. And I think that Jeremiah I would be very surprised if he dropped any further than top 25, to be honest.